Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great to see you all today for another conversation on the future of work. I would like to just quickly acknowledge the NSF for their partial support of our efforts here, and also the organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafaela Sadoun, Ora Chair, who's here with us today, and Manfred Chalagi. And then I would really like to thank Neha Kumar, who's an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. And she works in the general area of human-computer interaction and is really trying to look at how people use technology and what exactly their needs are from the perspective of looking at their lives directly and understanding what they do on a day-to-day basis. So we're very excited to have her here. And I should also mention that Neha and I both serve on the SICA Executive Committee. So she's contributing in multiple ways to our community. We have a panel today, and I'll ask Neha to introduce the panelists in a moment. But again, just to remind everybody, so this is recorded. Questions from the audience, we are very much looking forward to. Please type those in the chat, and Neha will be looking at those and calling on you. So with that, Neha, please take over.
Thanks, Andrew. At any point, if you have trouble hearing me, please just say something on chat because that will show up immediately. So yes, thank you for the introduction. I work in a field called Human-Computer Interaction for Development, so HCI4D. And I just wanted to mention that it's broadly an area where we look at HCI in the context of subfields of global development. My own focus has been much more on global health and different domains in global health, but there's also some other areas that I've been interested in, and more broadly looking at equitable futures. And so I was thinking about, what this panel kind of meant to me, and there were some questions that I also shared with the panelists, and we'll come to those in a second. But I also wanted to mention that there are a few different hats that I wear, and one of them is actually on the Future of Computing Academy within the ACM. And so that's a space where I do actively kind of think about what does the future of computing look like, right? And when we think about it in terms of socio-technical futures, when we think about it in terms of the society that we live in, what is the impact that computing can have in society? And so that is something that I'm coming to this panel with, and so the questions are going to be kind of focused on that. I wanted to jump in. I mean, there was a little more of an introduction I had, but I think one thing I will say is that as we're listening to the students' chat, I want us to also think about how there are different definitions of diversity and equity and inclusion that we're passionate about based on our life experiences, maybe the cultural backgrounds that we come from. And so how can we think about creating room for these perspectives to coexist? What does that look like for us in terms of our research and how our research kind of touches society? So there's very much kind of a focus on the spaces in between that I want us to think about today. And I think that will also come up when we're talking to students, at least some of the students that I know who are on the panel. They've been looking at research, but also activism and also entrepreneurship. And so thinking about how we interact with all of those spaces, I think, could be really interesting. So with that, let me just ask the students to introduce themselves. So what I did ask was for them to kind of think about, share a short introduction of what they do, but also in the context of the futures of work, and however you choose to kind of view and define the future of work. So let's start. Should I go in order? How should I do this? Let's start with Diana because she's the first person that I spoke with. So.
Hi, I'm Diana. My pronouns are she, they. I graduated Wellesley College, class of 2018. I majored in computer science and music. and I've been working in the Wellesley HCI lab ever since as a research fellow. So I've worked on a variety of projects, but my main project right now is I work on the mobile office, part of a larger NSF grant with different universities. And I work on seeing what the future of work in the car would look like. So right now I'm working on a project where we investigate user modality preferences in the car when working with autonomous vehicles.
Thank you. Sachin, why don't you go next? Because I see your face right next to Diana's.
Yeah, so it's nice to meet you all. Thanks for this opportunity. It's nice to see a lot of people from New England here. So I did my undergrad in New England, and actually once, since this is a New Hampshire hosted Zoom meeting, I actually accidentally once got a haircut in New Hampshire. So that's my one New Hampshire story. You can DM me to ask me for the story. I got very lost once. But yeah, I'm a PhD student in human-centered computing at Georgia Tech. I'm particularly interested in how identity-based attributes, so things such as gender identity or culture, right, class, have an influence on how we express our mental health and how we experience it. Especially curious about how technology and what we call technology-mediated mental health care systems can help to create communities of care where people get the kind of care that they need based on their identity-based attributes. I think that one of the ways that this work factors into like the futures of work is kind of similar to the like content moderation issues you see in terms of people working on these platforms with their like care labor, right? Their emotional labor being invisible, and no good support for them to feel better when they aren't feeling it. So sort of one of the questions I think about is in these bigger systems, as we expand like different forms of care that people have access to, how do we use people's experiences, right? How do we leverage them as assets without commodifying them, right? Without making it overwhelming for them to leverage these parts of who they are to help people.
Thanks, Sachin. Julia?
Hi, my name is Julia Burmeister. I work for Share in the HCI lab at Wellesley. I graduated Wellesley in 2019 as a media arts and sciences student. It's a hybrid major between the studio art department and the CS department. I specialized in fabrication, so that was my groove. Currently, I'm working on a project that is also under the Future of Work grant. It's a chatbot, however, to sort of facilitate productivity or meaningful productivity and wellness for people who are now working from home. So sort of like a little coach bot.
Thank you. Alberta, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Alberta, and I'm a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire. I work with Professor Andrew Cohn in the HCI lab, and I'm currently working on the future of work and well-being with this is a big collaboration with other schools, and we're particularly interested in how we can leverage technology to promote well-being. So specifically how we can use virtual reality to promote well-being as well as mindfulness.
Thank you. Aditya, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so nice to see you, Neha, and so nice to see everyone as well here. Thank you for having me. I'm Aditya. I'm a PhD student at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. I research and study the educational affordances of learning technologies and emerging technologies in K through 12 environments. And I currently have been specifically focusing on the educational merits of immersive virtual reality. And my goal really is trying to bridge the two worlds of computer science and kind of virtual reality with the field of the learning sciences, trying to really understand how we can bring the best of our understanding of pedagogy and curriculum into the VR space. And more specifically for my dissertation, I also have been looking at how VR can be a tool through perspective taking can be a tool for positive behavior change in the classroom, to motivate positive behavior change in the classroom. And we are currently specifically studying the effects of VR in teaching climate change and climate justice education in the classroom. I also have been involved in a couple of entrepreneurial ventures through my work. One is in the VR space, and another is more in the hands-on learning, maker space, and tinkering space, with a specific focus on India. And I think that also might be relevant to some of the conversations we're having here today.
Thanks, Aditya. And Angel?
Hello, I'm Angel Cooper. I'm an undergraduate researcher at Wellesley College, Wellesley HCI Lab, and I've been working in the lab for just over a year, and I'm currently working on developing the chatbot that Julia explained earlier.
Great. And Tolulope, did I say your name right? Please correct me
Yeah,
if I did.
Tolulope, but you can call me Tolu for short. And yeah, so yeah, my name is Tolulope. I'm a rising sophomore at Olin College of Engineering, majoring in electrical and computer engineering. But this summer, I've been working recently at the Wellesley HCI Lab on the Future of Work project. It's multifaceted, but like Angel and Julia said, we're working on the chatbot primarily. And my reason for working on it is I just believe that robots can help make people better at things, and there's a lot to explore with this research endeavor.
Thank you. I think that covers everyone's intro. Just checking. Okay. Okay. So moving on to kind of the next question is, and thank you for all of those introductions into your work. So one thing that I had asked you to kind of think about and share with us was, what challenges do you think lie before us when we think about futures of work? As relevant not only to the areas of work that you're in, right, like your particular research focus, but also the sort of the broader socio-technical systems that we're engaging with, whether it's mental health or, you know, K-12 education, or looking at, self-driving cars. How does your research kind of touch upon these social elements? And what do you think, what is your top concern, you would say, or maybe a couple of top concerns in this regard moving forward?
Can I start?
Absolutely.
Great. So in our work, in my work with the mobile office in particular, recently we've had discussions on how we can expand this work from just thinking about sort of knowledge workers, so-called knowledge workers, information workers, because this technology, although it's deemed to be like this thing that only certain socioeconomic classes can use, it's something that could benefit everyone. So we want to expand this technology to be able to work across different occupations and different socioeconomic statuses. So with our work with autonomous vehicles, instead of focusing just on, you know, professors or tech moguls, we want to think about how conditional automation could look in maybe truck drivers, rideshare workers, or EMTs, people who use their cars in their work, and how they could benefit from this kind of technology. Because a lot of the time, I feel that certain groups, brown, black, disabled, low-income workers, are excluded from the conversation in tech, because this sort of tech is only accessible to knowledge workers who have the kind of resources to access it. And we live in a privileged bubble. Being in academia is a privilege, and sometimes we get stuck only thinking about these certain groups because we're surrounded by them. And so I think part of the challenge is sort of breaking this glass ceiling of privilege, where we bring in more people from diverse groups to think about this, if we have researchers from different backgrounds, like I myself am from a low-income Latinx background, and bringing people like me who have these different thoughts is the most challenging step, but the most important step. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Trust me. I think yeah, this is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I want to ask also, and I want to hear obviously from others, and Julia, was I raised hand, or was that okay? So you were kind of that was a +1. Okay. I want to also ask Diana, and maybe others wanted pitch in here, but we talk a lot about representation, and representation is really, really critical. And I think this is one thing Andrew and I have also talked about recently, is what about going beyond representation? So when we get to the stage of having representation, shall we say, I almost feel like we don't know what to do next. And I want to know what you all think, if anyone would like to share their thoughts on that. So what do we do when we have more diversity, when we have more inclusive environments where we are including people from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different geographic backgrounds? What then? It's not an easy question. So just, whatever thoughts you have, I think we could benefit from hearing.
I think maybe I'd like to jump in. So I think it starts from having conversations such as these and breaking down what we already know. So we are conditioned to have different perspectives, but when you bring people from diverse backgrounds, sometimes it's hard to see the other side. It's hard to see where everyone is coming from. But we need to remember, in the technology field, we are designing products that are meant for everybody. And so we need these voices. These voices need to be heard in order for us to move forward with the products we are designing. I think that's a good first step.
Yep,
Thank you for that. Sachin?
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry, Neha.
No, please go ahead. I was just saying thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point from Alberta. Thank you for that as well. I think that there's also, right, like, I think it is super important, of course, to include as many voices as we can. One thing that I've seen in my work, though, is, like I mentioned, right, the commodification of these voices. So I think that there's often, like, so I'll give you an example. So in some ongoing work I'm doing, I've interviewed the people who create mental health memes, right, on these different types of mental health meme group, like different types of memes that have to deal with depression and anxiety. And one of the people that I interviewed was a moderator, a female moderator, right? Right, she identified as a woman of one of the groups. She created quite a bit of like content for the group, but a lot of the time she was singled out, right, for being someone who, like, well, so she was singled out for being the one person to make memes. So for example, to make memes that relate to her gender identity. So for example, what would happen is, whenever she wanted to touch on subjects that weren't related to her gender identity, the other male meme moderators would often say, hey, why aren't you touching on things that relate to this one aspect of your identity? So I think there's also a very important thing to think about here, especially in the context of mental health, right? Of how we incorporate these identity-based attributes without making people feel like commodified because of them. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew, for muting and unmuting me. Sorry, it's too much actually. Someone asked this question and it's too much to go back and forth, I feel, with the phone, so I wasn't doing that. Yeah, Sachin, and I think in your work in particular, at least from what we've worked on together, I think there's also the aspect of how much information is shared, right? So we've seen that in the case of helplines. And I think if we look at helplines as an example, there are people participating, right? And we know from knowing who they are, what their backgrounds might be, that a communication channel where we have only partial information. And so often we are in situations where we have partial information about who we're talking to and who's part of the group, and we fill in the rest, right? And I think this goes back to the point that Alberta raised, which was about kind of breaking down what we already know, that we make certain assumptions, we connect the dots ourselves. And maybe there's something in that connection of the dots that we need to kind of rethink as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone else. So let's say we think about, design sessions. I don't know how many of you kind of really think about design in your work, but let's say that you do, and there are various methods like participatory design, for instance, that might include different voices. And let's say that you have a group where you have participation from different backgrounds. What do you think are the challenges that might arise? And I think this is also good, and I don't want to be kind of silent about what's going on in the world we're living in right now, because most of us, I think, are in the US who are calling in. Maybe some of us are not, and I don't mean to exclude you from the conversation, but just given everything that's going on about racial injustice, and really thinking about also within computing, conversations around facial recognition is an example where technologists have a huge impact on how things are being seen in the social realm. There is a responsibility, increasingly people are saying, for us, for scholars like us, students like you, to think about how our work is engaging with society, how it's impacting society. And we cannot do that unless we have the tools and the methods to really approach that, right? So I want to know, what do you think about building a toolkit to working towards inclusive and equitable futures? What does that toolkit look like for you?
I think I just wanted to bring up a quick point to talk about the extent of how racial biases affects society and algorithms. I recently shared an article on my Twitter that talked about how one man was wrongfully convicted because of an algorithm that misidentified him, facial recognition. And this man was Black. And it just goes to show what kind of impact this racial bias that we all have, really, affects people. It's dangerous. We have a lot of power in our hand. It's something we need to take seriously because the stakes are high. This affects real people. So just to kind of support your point.
I was unmuted. Thank you, Andrew, but I'd really like to hear from someone else.
I have a quick comment here. I think your point on design and how we engage with the design of our interventions is really important. And I think one big challenge that I tend to see a lot with design work is it usually ends up happening at one stage in the process, almost usually in the very beginning. And then you're not really engaging with your stakeholders. You have that one design thinking workshop or that one participatory design exercise, or just a few of those, but you're doing that usually at that ideation stage when things are open-ended. But when you start concretizing your work, when you start actually going deeper into the details, you're very rarely then engaging with your final community. And I think I would like to think of ways in which we're doing design in context end to end throughout the entire life cycle of, if you're especially looking at a product that you're developing or an intervention of some sort, where your stakeholders are involved in the process all through, not just in the ideation, but in the prototyping, in the testing, sure, and also in the various iterations, and also engaging your stakeholders sometimes can really be lip service and it needs to be done in a very meaningful way. And what I kind of envision for that would be having your stakeholders in leadership positions, in decision-making positions within your work, not as people who are giving you ideas and opinions that you can choose to engage with or not engage with, but having those voices. And to give a simple example, when we work with teachers a lot, and I think it's really important to have teachers who are actually PIs on the research project that you're running, or at least to have teaching background, and not just doing that one workshop with 10 teachers who give you their experiences, and then you're two academics sitting in the lab developing the next stages of your project. And I think a lot of projects tend to, in the education space, tend to do that, where a lot of the grants are co-authored by a STEM instructor in a school and an academic researcher, and I see a lot of value in having the stakeholders in leadership and decision-making capacities in the design process.
Thanks, Aditya. Yeah, I think that's a really key point. So again, goes back to making sure that multiple voices are represented. And when we think about multiple voices, we have to think about them at multiple levels, right? So what does diversity and inclusion look like, not just in terms of the people we think of as our end users, but also people who have a voice throughout the design process. Also people who have a voice in the ideation process, right? And so there's a question that is connected to that that I want to read out by Peter Malhorter. I hope I'm not butchering your name. So do panelists feel that there are enough connections between the technical disciplines that we're in and the disciplines in the humanities who study social injustice, like gender studies or Africana studies? What role might cross-disciplinary connections play in building a more inclusive future of technology? And what might those connections look like? So to me, that question is really also about, thinking about the research, right? So before you've actually entered into your research site, how do you take a cross-disciplinary approach, which is really like, how do you include diversity of thought into the research questions that you're asking? Any thoughts on that? Yes, it is a hard question, but that's okay. We don't have to come up with the best answers. We're just hearing each other's thoughts here. So,
I think I've been thinking about the future of work in the context of disabled people who have, for their entire lives, pretty much been repeatedly denied accommodations to work from home. Having been told that accommodations to work from home due to their disabilities are like unreasonable or unfair. And now suddenly the entire world is shifting to working from home. And so I think anything we do now to like in studying remote workers to understand and optimize and normalize remote work could end up helping disabled people in the future. I think more of a connection between not just gender studies and Africana studies, but also disability studies and so on could just more of a connection between all of these disciplines could help, because technology is ubiquitous in everyone's lives.
someone said 100,000. Oh, I was talking. As someone said, 100,000% true. So completely agree. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Anyone else want to try and address that question? So I guess I might say, Sachin, do you have thoughts don't mean to do any cold calling here, but actually in the work that you're doing around mental health, you are talking kind of all the time to people from very different backgrounds, right? Do you think that, I guess, how do you think that space could be navigated in other areas as well? Like, what do you think you've gained from that multidisciplinary perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Neha mentioned, a lot of the work that we do leverages, right, different theories from particularly medical anthropology, right? And I think that one of the things that's been quite helpful in terms of the research that we've done, right, is kind of what Aditya said, right? In that, though I will say this, though, I don't know if our work has necessarily been in conversation with gender studies necessarily, right? I think that there are elements of like GNSS in our research, but I think what's been helpful is hearing feedback, and also like hearing feedback both from researchers in our field, but also researchers who are outside of our field and practitioners, in terms of whether we are using the theories that we use in our research, right, or especially the medical anthropology theories, the way that they were intended to be used, right? So rather than it being a sort of like you know those like claws at the arcade, right, that pick up one little toy and like put it in the basket, right? Rather than it being like a one little cookie cutter approach in terms of how we like use a theory in our research, having it sort of be a continuous conversation even after we have finished the research with like different people who are like really like knowledgeable in the fields that we're borrowing from, right? Like disability justice or like medical anthropology, I think has been particularly useful, because I think going back to sort of the question about concerns, right? So I've seen research out there that like what I like to call like well-being towards harm, right? So for example, like the human terrain system is one example of like anthropologists assisting the military, right, in doing pretty harmful things. Another form of this kind of well-being towards harm is like mindfulness apps, right, or mindfulness that is used to help soldiers, right, or maybe to help the police, right, to do things that can often and like really harm people. I think that having this kind of continuous conversation with the people from the fields that we're leveraging these theories from helps us avoid like designing technology that maybe in this one like cookie cutter like claw scenario works well, but overall kind of violates the spirit and the like the background of this sort of theory.
Absolutely. And then I also want to kind of bring in the perspective, you know, that often we struggle with, right? So we do want to work in these multidisciplinary groups, and we do want to work with people who think very differently from us. But then the issue sometimes can be that we have too many different perspectives, right? And so I think the challenge might be to navigate that space of just kind of finding what we have in common, even though we have all of these differences. And so again, like the spaces in between and how we navigate those in a way that's productive and constructive, I suppose, but also leaving room for difficult conversations. So it's, I don't know. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Like, how do we create spaces to have those difficult conversations when everything is not hunky-dory? And you cannot just say that, you know, we need diversity. Like, again, it goes back to the question of, yes, we now have representation, we now have diversity. We don't right now, but let's assume that we do. How do we prepare ourselves for the next steps? Like, how do we treat these different voices with the right kind of respect, with the right kind of regard for different types of knowledges, so that we're actually able to keep moving forward?
I was kind of thinking of something with that. I think kind of to answer Peter's question and going back from the bottom up approach, I think we have to start by dismantling what the image of tech looks like right now. And that's a big task, a very cultural thing. But for a while now, tech has looked like a white cis male maker space. And it's changing. We have things like Black Girls Code and Girls Who Code to empower marginalized groups, but obviously we have to keep going with that. And that's where the diversity can really start. If we get them young to understand that, hey, someone who looks like you can also be in this world. It doesn't just have to be someone who looks like you, and you don't have to act a certain way. Like I majored in music and computer science, and that's supposed to be kind of strange, but there's a way to merge my two interests. There's a way to bring in that diversity in ways that I would not have thought about when I was in high school programming. And that's where I think mentorship comes in. That's a big role as well. And I can talk more about that later.
Hi. Hi, Anupra this side, and I would just like to share my reflections on, if we have representation from diverse backgrounds, then how do we start those difficult communications or interactions? I will be sharing my reflection from the perspective of design workshops. So I have worked on mental health, and currently I'm working on menstrual health in India. So how I approach that particular thing is that, the first step is understanding the language. Yes, if in the hypothetical state, we have people from different diverse backgrounds as our participants, they have their own experiences, they have their own languages. So first step as a researcher, I think we can do is, develop the vocabulary of languages which they are comfortable with. That could be one step. The second step could be, the artifacts which we use in doing design research or design workshops. So different people might associate different artifacts with particular phenomena. So one particular artifact which might have a positive connotation for a participant might not have a positive connotation for another participant. So I cannot just walk in with the fixed set of artifacts and assume that, people and participants would be comfortable using them. So when I am designing a workshop, I have to be inclusive from that particular perspective also, the artifacts I am using, the language I am using. And also there should be one deliberate attempt of designing an ice-breaking workshop first, standalone, so that, all the participants are on the same page, they know where they're coming from, they are comfortable with their thought process. And then we can learn from that and, go forward. Like just Aditya said that, design workshops or design should not just be limited to the initial phase. It should be a weaved process throughout the whole process. But for that, the first initial workshop or the first conversation needs to be really informal so that we develop that comfort among our participants to just establish that notion of safe space. That's what I have realized over the various conversations I have been having with my participants back in India. I hope that makes a little bit sense here. And Neha, you are on mute. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I was saying, thank you, Anupra. So I'm one of Anupriya's advisors, and we've been working in the space of mental health more recently. And I think the point I'd like to abstract out, especially here, which I think is relevant to a lot of the work that the students mentioned, is about how there are different dimensions of diversity and inclusion, right, that we need to consider in the work that we do. So language and vocabulary is one, but also the cultural artifacts, the design prompts or technology prompts that we might use in the work that we do, and what those mean to the different people that we are working with. So I think that is definitely something that kind of is sort of one of the next things that we think about when we're thinking about representation. This also speaks to the point, I think, that Preeti brought up in the chat. So connecting with diverse user groups, the need for patience and empathy, and so thinking about levels of familiarity, right, of all of the people who are kind of involved in the process. And then a question that just came up, so let me read this out. How can we define axes of diversity without biases? How can we include vulnerable, less privileged societies without thinking war is a normal state in Middle East, or it is normal that less people from Far East are fluent in English? This is a really great question. I think like how I read it, and maybe you read it differently, but one of the things that in my class we were discussing yesterday, and I also shared this on Twitter, it's a great article on decolonizing HCI education from a Latin American perspective. And this is a paper that really kind of looks at how we learn these things in the classroom, right? And how we come in with a certain perspective where we think of certain things as being normal. So in the US, we think that everything we learn about the global north is normal and everything else is kind of off, right? And if we're looking at certain contexts, we might think that certain things are normal and then others are not. So what in your work do you think kind of, what in that resonates with you in your work? What do you think of as being normal versus not? And how do we expand on the definition of normal, really, right? Because that is essentially what we're trying to do when we are more inclusive. We're constantly trying to expand what we think of as normal.
So I really like the idea of having the icebreaker because, like you said, normal for you might not be normal for me. And it's only by interacting and learning from people that we actually know what's normal in their own space and what's normal for us. And so then the definition of normal becomes what everyone else is comfortable with. Because we cannot just assume in that whole little bubbles that what's normal for us is normal for someone else. And so the idea of having some form of an informal conversation or an icebreaker really then starts to shift our perspective of what is actually normal.
Yeah, and there are some great resources as well that speak to those kind of blind spots that we have, right? So what are things that we could do as researchers who are also in the business of knowledge production, and I am calling it a business? How do we think about how could we do a better job?
To piggyback on what you just said, there are numerous resources available to learn other cultures, to learn other beliefs. And I think it's our responsibility as well to do a little extra research on the people we are trying to help or the people we are working with, and then go ahead to ask questions that would give us more information about the people we're working with.
Yeah. Anyone else? Anyone in the audience want to speak?
I have a quick comment here. I think we often assume that it's perfectly normal to build all our platforms and content and technologies to an English-speaking audience, and I don't think we emphasize that enough. We talk about ESL learners, and we talk a lot about people for whom English is not even their third language, but not enough. There is a very small percentage of the population in the world today that actually does speak English as its first language, and I mean this is clearly, a huge problem with every single tool we design. It's very, very language specific and language centric. And these challenges only get exacerbated in times of crises like COVID. I mean, when you did have all the school closures, a lot of companies and platforms, both nonprofits and for-profits, came up saying that, hey, we have ton of online content, we have tons of resources that you can leverage and use today. And if you just look at the statistics for just the United States, for all the schools that were successfully able to transition online, it's almost all those schools where the communities that they served were communities that were white, that spoke English, that were not immigrant or migrant communities largely, and had access to technology. And so these assumptions that we have that everyone has a computer, everyone has internet, everyone can speak English, are very fundamental, and we have to really are very fundamental in our research, and we have to really question these from the get-go. And then also speaking a little more about the access problem, yes, we can say that online learning or MOOCs and access to video is something that more people are increasingly having over the world today. But where video is arriving today, in communities where it is arriving today, at the same time, in extremely wealthy, well-off private schools, they're using the next generation of tools and technologies, which is going to take another decade to get to all the other users. And this is largely happening because the places where these tools are being created are largely concentrated in very homogeneous, privileged, well-off environments. And universities too, right? Universities are often always located in these centers of innovation and therefore are biased towards creating a very one-dimensional kind of technology and tool. So, and I'm specifically thinking of Silicon Valley when I make these points, is how do you get that Silicon Valley entrepreneur to leave his bay and really see what's happening in another part of the world, or even in a different part of the United States, when you're building that next generation masterclass or that next augmented reality tool, assuming that everybody has access to basic internet, basic language literacy levels, basic resources, mobility, agency, and the ability to even interact and engage with these tools from an accessibility, learning, language perspective. And so it's really, really fundamental. And it definitely, collaboration is one piece here where you have to bring all these stakeholders to the table. As academics, we can be doing a lot of research, hypothesizing a lot about what could be a future, but the people who are actually moving and shaking this field are entrepreneurs and the corporate world, and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. And there needs to be a way in which all these stakeholders are part of that discourse for us to make any progress here.
Yeah, I agree with what Aditya said there. And I think that a major problem, I guess, in our way of thinking is when we envision the word normal, it's typically a projection of ourselves. Like, for example, the people who invented facial recognition software primarily were white males. So when they were testing it out, they would be testing it out on themselves because to themselves, they were normal. So software like that would be biased against people of color and people who don't identify as cisgendered males. And even like when I think about my own experiences, I as a male often find myself falling into the trap of seeing male-oriented stuff as normal. And that's been something that I've had to unlearn, I guess you could say. And just looking at the chat, I think that the way we address the problem of all these like deeply rooted biases is beginning to understand that our experiences pertain to us primarily, and realizing that we actually need to actively go out there and seek for people who have experienced stuff that's been different from what we've gone through, people who are not afraid to push back against our own preconceived notions. And that's when we actually begin to take the first step towards real change. I guess one good example of this is like looking at like Fox News, for example. They might have people of color on their panels, but many times those people have gone through experiences of privilege, whether it be socioeconomic or otherwise, and their ideals still align with the ideals of the people on Fox News. So although they may be people of color or not cisgendered males, their surface level diversity is not really much more than just tokenism. So I think an important thing to understand is that diversity is a means to the end of equality, and without the advent of having differing ideals and differing experiences to build off on to create a more leveled playing field, we'll never really achieve the equality that we seek. That's just my take.
Neha, you're on mute. Can't hear you.
Okay, I should not be trying to do this, Andrew. I should just leave it to you, but I tried to mute myself on my phone. Anyway, I was saying thank you so much for sharing that, because I was thinking that there are aspects of our identity that that are more tied to kind of the physical aspects of our being, right? Like skin color, this is something we deal with, like what we look like. But then there's also other aspects that have to do with values and belief systems that are, you know, less easy to pin down. And those also make such a big difference to how inclusive spaces really are. So yeah, thank you for that perspective. Well, we're almost out of time. If anyone has to go, of course, you can. I spoke to Andrew about this initially, and he said that we can go over if there are people who want to stay over for a few minutes longer. I did want us to talk about, you know, taking kind of a more self-reflexive approach, thinking about the futures that we want to construct around us. So what are the futures of work that we want to be responsible for creating? And how do we simultaneously, as we're going about our research, how do we work on that? So, you know, this could be about what you see as your sites of intervention. It could be about your workplace. It could be about where you want to have impact. But any thoughts on that?
I want to quickly go back to my point of mentorship in specifically maybe the space of academia, but in broader space of tech. So as a low-income Latinx college student who came into academia for the first time, I didn't know how to navigate this world or even how to find resources to help me navigate the world. And there were many discouraging moments trying to figure these out and a lot of growing pain. So I think we as mentors have to understand the impact of the things we say to different marginalized groups. And the bigger thing is we have to uplift them, show them we're here to help as mentors and provide resources and create a culture where we feel like they're welcome, like we're all welcome. And I don't think that exists right now in the tech sphere. And I'm optimistic that this will change, and I hope that this is what the future can look like. We can mentor these different groups, students especially. Maybe that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think it's an important point.
I want to speak to the point of mentorship, though. There are two things that come to mind. And so one is, you know, I was planning to look up this quote online that I saw and I've forgotten. But basically it said that everyone, once they cross a certain age, I want to say 40 maybe, should have an under 25 mentor. And so there needs to be kind of, and that speaks to the point of mentorship going both ways. So it's not just about, you know, people who are young, who are early in their career, seeking mentorship from others who might be older, might be more experienced, but also the other way around. I mean, I certainly have an appointed under 25 mentor who almost daily teaches me to kind of push on my boundaries. And I think that that's always like a little bit challenging, but it's necessary. But that speaks to a larger point that you brought up, which is about health, and I want to share that as well. So early on in my PhD, I was certainly of the notion that what the work that I was doing was around helping people. And I've been forced to question that many times in my life, but the first time was when I came across this quote, which is by Lilla Watson, an Aboriginal activist, and it's attributed to her. I think it is actually more broadly from kind of the community where she works, which goes like this: if you are here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you think that your liberation is bound up in mine, then we can work together. And I think that speaks to the point of, when we think we're helping, are we also being helped? And how is that, what is that kind of separation in working together that we can try to achieve? And I think it's really important to think about that, because we don't want to get into this kind of framing of we're sort of uplifting the world without actually being, impacted ourselves. The thoughts on mentorship, on
piggybacking off of your point and Diana's point, something I've been thinking about a lot is somehow being able to cultivate community, and especially given the pandemic that we're experiencing, I feel that work has been more and more mediated by technology, and in ways can be very isolating. And even though I'm face to face with some of you, I don't have the same experience of like having that human connection. And so like what does that mean for our mental health or our workplace culture, or the ability to like have that sort of like back and forth mentorship when you don't have like the same like bantering or like the small moments that create like the bonding in the workplace. So yeah, I'm curious about how we can perhaps like create a culture through this like mediated experience that offers like a better way of sort of like bonding with each other, because I think that's really important.
Certainly my hope is that we won't be in this state for too long. And so I hope that will change and these small moments will return. I think the flip side of that is also that I feel I've been fortunate to form many new relationships, because everything has been online, and so everything has been kind of reduced to online and not, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're in the US or in India or in Australia or whatever, everyone is kind of equally distant. But what are others' thoughts on this, and kind of cultivating these, like using these online channels maybe as forming more meaningful relationships that might become long-term relationships and post-COVID?
On the flip side, I hope maybe we can take away some of the lessons we learned from this coronavirus time about how we can leverage technology to help people. Like Angel was saying, before, people with disabilities may not have been afforded the privilege of working from home or having access to all these things. But we've learned through this time that yes, we can leverage technologies and use them in different ways that can support this traditional office workspace. And it doesn't have to be like that. We can integrate technology into it a little differently.
Yeah. I mean, if there aren't other thoughts, maybe we can then try to close out this panel by just sharing kind of last thoughts that people have on the panel. And then also, if anyone else wants to share, like what are questions that have come up for you in the panel that you might want to think more about? What do you think we as a group need to think more about? What do faculty need to think more about?
I think I do have some thoughts, and I think they kind of fit along with the great comments that were just made. So I really like the quote from Tolu, right? Diversity is a means to right, this end of equality. And I think one of the things that has been helpful, additionally, also in terms of thinking about how we, right, how we use technology to support the communities we have or create new kinds of communities, I think, is right, thinking about the kinds of futures we want to see. I think that, and the kinds of futures we want to see, as well as the different ways that the tools we have can contribute to that kind of future. So, for example, in a lot of papers that I've read in HCI, right, they're great work, and but I think that the discussion section always goes into like incremental adjustments to the kind of world we have now, and then connects it right to things that could potentially happen in the future. I think I've one thing that has been helpful for me, and one of the things that I think we've discussed a bit on this panel, is thinking about what the future we want to see is, right? The equitable future, right? The future in which people's capacities, right, and their identity-based attributes are valued just as much as their skills, right? And kind of working back from there to see what implications that future has for the tools that we have now and how we can like achieve that future. So going a little bit backwards from the world we want to see rather than going forwards from what we have now.
100%. Who'd like to go next?
I could add something if I may. I'm not a panelist, but I could add something.
Please.
So I was thinking that one of the luckiest parts or luckiest chances that we have is that future, maybe, I don't know if it's luck, but it's going through more intelligent agents, automations, and so on. And these intelligent agents, let's call them so, have these superpowers that we don't have. Like, for example, they don't judge. They don't have these biases. They don't have this cultural, for example. They are not I don't know, they are not towards males oriented, or they are not always like by white color of the skin and biased or so on. And that's a good thing, because then, for example, in a lot of domains like jobs or industry 4 context, when your colleague is replaced, let's hope not, but I mean, like, your colleague is replaced by one of these machines, then you can actually feel a little bit more secure, and maybe you can actually have a more meaningful interaction with this unbiased colleague of yours than you would have with a normal human being with biases. And I think we could, in our designs, really consider these superpowers of these intelligent agents and integrate them for more diversity and inclusion. So that's what came to my mind.
Can I say something?
Yes, please, Shivani.
Yeah, hi. At this point, just adding to what you just said, I want to say that it's important. We want to make them unbiased, but I think it's a very active effort, and we constantly need to be asking those questions about how we want to make them unbiased, because by default, they will not be. They're just going to mimic the biases that we have right now. And I did have a question for you all. I want to understand, we've been talking about the future that we want to move towards, about the future which is equitable for people, for communities. But would you like to offer some practical advice in terms of, say, when we do have these tools or things that we want to bring to those communities, after we've designed for them, designed with them, I mean, how do we really take it to them? Because I feel like there's often this huge gap that we see. Yeah, I'm curious to hear if you all have any thoughts on that.
Anyone want to take this question?
Can I jump in? I'm not a panelist, but
yes. Hi, Nadia.
Hi, Neha. So I something that has made me think a lot is that, like, when we try to solve like communities' problem, like we try to like take a technology and be like, here, this solves your problem, or like, let's design together, like we come up with something, but it's not sustainable. Like, I think it's important to give the like the community that want to help, or like, I think it's important to empower the people to solve their problems themselves, just like give them the tools that they might need, and not try to be the big brother and just be like, here, I have a hammer, try to solve your problems, and like their problems might not even need a hammer. So like, I think, and like, I don't know how that can, like, it's a very big, like, I don't know if like it can be solved like in a day or two, but like, I think empowering the community to like make the solutions themselves is the way to go. Because like, if it's not that way, then like we help them make something and then it's not sustainable. Like, I've like read a lot of papers that like the community and the researchers like make something together, and then after the researchers leave, it does not stay there. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with that. That was part of my question too. Like, how do you really not stop at that phase and kind of take it forward? Yeah.
If I can say something, I'm also not a panelist.
Please, Christina.
So I've worked with Neha. I'm not in computer science, and I'm actually in international affairs. I'm in international development. That is my passion. But I feel like there's a lot to gain from collaboration from academics, say on my field, and together with you, where we have studied a lot of these issues, you know, inclusivity, international development. I'm actually talking to you from Ecuador. And, you know, the difficulties of bringing solutions, even when you're an Ecuadorian yourself, you know, when you reach out, it turns out that maybe their priorities are not gonna be solved with a technology tool per se. But actually their priorities or aspirations require something else rather than a technology device. And, you know, trying to find ways to collaborate, I think is key between disciplines so that we can learn from each other. Because I feel like there's no conversation from, you know, what we're talking about in, say, my field versus what is being talked about in HCI and ICT4D. But I feel like there is a great space for collaboration.
So I want to ask, actually, that's a great point. Thank you, Christina. I want to ask, what comes in the way of collaboration? What prevents us from collaborating with each other?
I wouldn't know, because I've reached out, you know, because I know that there are ways to complement both, you know, social programs with technology. But say in Ecuador, a lot of people don't even have access to internet. So it is finding maybe whatever they already use in order to, in a way, make more impact, you know, not just thinking this great app, whereas in reality, in most of Latin America, not a lot of them have smartphones or a full, you know, data plan. So how could you like tone it down in terms of technology so that you can fulfill both, you know, the aspirations that they have as people, because they might be very different from what you think they need, you know, with the tools that you design and that can actually be applied. But I feel like there are ways to collaborate. I'm just not sure what is the best way for people that are not inside, you know, the HCI and computer science field.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you speak to some of the access issues, right? So how do we even connect people who bring these different perspectives? And there are very real, very practical issues to that. And then there's the question of, well, even if we were able to, there are other kind of invisible boundaries that exist, right? So there are disciplinary boundaries, like Peter just mentioned, institutional structures, concerns about what counts towards tenure, for instance, right? So, I mean, I, for one, feel very grateful to have a joint appointment, but then, yeah, that also kind of brings up the question of what knowledge do people from different backgrounds consider to be valid, what they consider to be legitimate, right? And so I wanted to speak to this question of power, which is that when we have different voices, there are always some voices that have a little more power, seem to be a little more legitimate than others, right? And there are certainly scholars who have talked about this forever, but in terms of kind of managing those power differentials, like how do you think we could address those? How do you think we could deal with those within our academic circles?
So I would just like to first piggyback on what Nadia and Christina said, that technology cannot be the solution. A sustainable way could be, yes, we can design technological tools in collaboration where only the technological tools are not going to empower the community. It needs to be a hybrid approach where technological tools could be one component of the whole package to empower the community to solve their problem. That's how I summed these two line of thoughts. And then coming down to the role of power when we are having diverse voices, I think again I would like to go back to what I said previously is when we start having a conversation, when we are sitting together, the very first step should be, you know, having informal conversation. I think that is the first step to even identify the voices which are overpowering. And only then, you know, having a good discussion around that, understanding the perspective and experiences of the other person and all the people in the discussion might help to find that, again, common ground. I don't know how to completely eliminate that, but that could be one way of approaching the situation.
I agree.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you, but yes, Tolu, please.
So I agree with what was just said about possibly having like the first meetup or communication be more informal and like jovial. Like when there was actually like research done on like police and like policing, and communities in which the police actually were more invested in the community, in where they were policing. So like they had a house there, they had families there, their kids went to the schools, so they knew people around those areas. They were less likely to have cases of police brutality as opposed to districts that had police come in from other communities to police those communities. And that kind of shows what was just being talked about in terms of like being able to have that connection with people beyond just professional, beyond the professional scope, and being able to see them as human beings and knowing that they have emotions, they have hopes and dreams and stuff like that, definitely plays a major role in being able to work with them and seeing them less as a walking political ideology. Because in like the world we live in, I feel like that's something that's much too prevalent like people see other people as walking political ideologies across the board, and that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
100%. Thank you so much for saying that. And I was going to say also, responding to Anupriya, the same thing, that we forget that we're human first. And I think that's just a simple truth that we just need to keep reminding ourselves of, that we are human first. We have feelings, not just political agendas. We have, you know, relationships that matter. Like, all of that is easily forgotten. So Andrew has kind of signaled to me politely that maybe we should start wrapping up. What I wanted to say is that we can wrap up the panel, but if anyone wants to stay, you know, informally to have a chat, to talk about anything at all that we've been talking about, then we can stay back and do that. And I can stop playing moderator and we can just have an informal conversation. So whoever needs to go, thank you so much for attending. I think Andrew also needed to say something else about the next week's panel or something, right?
Just very brief. First of all, thank you all to all the panelists. Thank you to everybody who participated, and thank you, Neha, for running the panel. This was really very insightful. I really enjoyed it. And yes, next Thursday we'll talk about augmented reality and the future of work with Joe Gabbard. And what I'll do now is I'll stop the recording, but please stay on, and or if you have to leave, please leave, but otherwise we can have an informal discussion. So